The courtroom hadn't realized it yet, but Jalen had. Judge Grayson believed he was about to sentence another naive teenager, until the defendant began dismantling the case like a practiced attorney. Inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse, the air hung heavy, thick with anticipation. The gallery brimmed with spectators, their hushed murmurs filling the silence as they watched the unexpected scene unfold. At the defense table, the young man standing beside it seemed almost swallowed by its size. Hands buried in his pockets, chin slightly raised, a quiet defiance flickering in his posture. Jalen Dawson, 19 years old, charged with grand theft auto and resisting arrest, serious charges that could define his future. Yet the way Judge Walter Grayson's gaze lingered on him made it clear. This trial was about more than just the law. Grayson leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lazily against the polished wood desk. His eyes peered down at Jalen over the rim of his glasses, lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You think you're some kind of legal expert?" His voice carried dry amusement. "This isn't a debate club, kid." Scattered chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor shared in the joke. But Jalen didn't flinch. He wasn't laughing. He had prepared for this moment for years, just not like this. He never imagined standing here as a defendant. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Jalen memorized case law. While his friends played video games, he staged mock trials in his head, arguing imaginary cases against himself. His mother, Denise Dawson, a paralegal for more than 2 decades, had filled their home with stories of how prosecutors cut corners, how judges played favorites, how some defense attorneys barely tried. Jalen soaked it all in. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most first-year law students. None of that mattered to Judge Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another kid in trouble. "Liao," Judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "Let's make this quick. I have a golf game at 2. The gallery chuckled again, but this time Jalen's lips curled into a faint smirk. Grayson had just made his first mistake. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington rose from his seat, exuding the confidence of a man who had already won. His crisp suit, perfectly knotted tie, and rehearsed voice painted the picture of someone who had delivered this same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught red-handed behind the wheel of a stolen 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The weight of his words settled over the room. Judge Grayson glanced at Jalen, then back at the prosecutor. "Go on." Carrington strolled toward the jury box, polished shoes clicking against the floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is some unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Jalen for the first time. "But let's be honest. What kind of victim runs from the police?" The room seemed to tighten. Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin in his palm. Still, Jalen didn't blink. Carrington flipped through a stack of papers. "Your Honor, we have testimony from Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before the attempted flight. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest was by the book." Grayson nodded slowly. "Sounds straightforward." To me, it probably sounded straightforward to everyone in the room. A stolen car, a chase, an arrest. But Jalen had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks. Even if no one else could, he stayed silent, watching, waiting. "Judge." Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." His eyes shifted toward Lisa Thornton, the public defender assigned to the case. She had barely spoken 3 words since the trial began. Lisa stood, adjusting her jacket, shifting awkwardly. "Your Honor, my client." Jalen's hand touched her arm. A silent request. She froze, then slowly sat back down. For the first time, Jalen's voice broke through the heavy silence. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went still. Judge Grayson's eyebrows lifted, amused. "You'll what?" Jalen's tone remained calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Even the bailiff's eyes widened. Prosecutor Mitchell Carrington's smirk flickered for just a second before he chuckled under his breath. This should be interesting. But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. The weight of the room settled on him. Hands still tucked in his pockets, Jalen let the silence stretch, just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Carrington crossed his arms, trying to mask his boredom. Go ahead. Jalen took a slow step forward. You stated Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest? Correct? Carrington let out a short breath. That's right. And that testimony is included in his official report? Of course it is. Jalen nodded slowly, then turned to the judge. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. Grayson's eyes narrowed. On what grounds? Jalen finally pulled his hands from his pockets. Calm, steady gestures cutting through the air. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. In fact, Jalen continued, taking another step forward, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Carrington's smirk tightened. The first crack in his polished confidence. What are you talking about? Jalen's voice stayed cool, deliberate. Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to request Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report claims he witnessed me in the vehicle, those logs should confirm his location. He let the pause linger. But something tells me they won't. The tension in the room shifted, heavier now. Grayson glanced toward Carrington. The prosecutor cleared his throat, flipping through his papers. That report was filed by a trained officer, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over law enforcement? Jalen's lips curved into the faintest shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, the GPS data will prove it. He let the sentence hang in the air. But if he wasn't, he didn't have to finish. The implication was clear. Judge Grayson leaned back, studying Jalen carefully, longer than before. Then his gaze shifted to Carrington. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the GPS logs? Carrington's pause was only a second, but long enough for everyone to notice. The jury, the gallery, and the judge. Jalen had seen that hesitation before, in countless trials he'd studied. A confident prosecutor wouldn't stall. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor, Carrington's jaw clenched. No objections, Your Honor. But the balance in the room had already shifted. For the first time, no one was laughing anymore. Carrington shuffled his papers, trying to recover. While we wait for those records, the fact remains. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen gave a small nod, face unreadable. That's true. He stepped forward. But let's talk about that evidence for a second. Grayson raised an eyebrow, gesturing for him to continue. Jalen turned, facing the jury, locking eyes with each of them one by one. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car automatically means I stole it. He let the words sink in. But let's break that down logically. His voice remained calm, measured, every word landing with quiet precision. Imagine you walk into a department store, try on a jacket, zip it up, slip your hands into the pockets, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few jurors leaned forward slightly, listening. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that jacket. He paused. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it automatically mean you stole it? The room seemed to exhale all at once. A couple of jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered, under their breath. Jalen didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. His voice stayed even. I was inside that store with 3 friends, and yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. Jalen's voice was steady, cutting through the heavy silence. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. He paused, letting the confession hang in the air. I didn't think much of it, didn't take the car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything inside. He let the weight of his own words settle. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. Another pause, longer this time. Then his voice sliced through the tension like a scalpel. Does touching something automatically make you a criminal? Carrington's throat cleared as he shuffled through his notes, searching, scrambling. But Jalen was already one step ahead. And while we're talking about fingerprints, he turned to Judge Grayson. Calm, calculated. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Grayson blinked, caught off guard by the question. His gaze flicked toward Carrington. The prosecutor's hesitation was just half a second too long. No. Jalen's lips pressed together, like that was the exact answer he'd been waiting for. So, let me get this straight. His voice stayed low, razor sharp. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence? He took another slow step forward. No chance for me to cross-examine, no questions about the chain of custody, no way to challenge the accuracy of the analysis. He glanced at the jury, locking eyes with them again. That's not justice. Carrington's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. Jalen leaned back just a little. Interesting. Judge Grayson let out a long, tired breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. The case was supposed to be routine, another open and shut conviction. But now, it was falling apart. Jalen stepped forward one last time, his voice steady but firmer now. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the stolen vehicle. Grayson frowned. The owner? Jalen nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the Audi. He reached into his folder, pulling out a printed transcript. This statement was given to police the night the car was reported stolen, but for some reason it never made its way into the prosecution's filings. He turned toward Carrington, and I think we both know why. Carrington's face went pale. Jalen held up the paper and began to read. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. He looked up slowly, letting the next line hit like a gunshot. I saw the kid, and he was white. The whole courtroom gasped. Even Judge Grayson sat back in his chair, stunned. Jalen lifted the paper higher. That's from the original police report. His voice was calm, surgical. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned to the jury, letting the truth sink in. The arresting officer left this out of his testimony. The prosecution ignored it, and yet they're asking you to believe I'm guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Carrington shot to his feet, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. No. Jalen's voice cut him off. Sharp, precise. I wasn't caught in possession of the vehicle. He took another step forward. His eyes locked on the jury. I was arrested, blocks away, walking home after buying snacks with my friends. His voice never wavered. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. He let the words hang in the air. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. The silence was deafening. Judge Grayson leaned back, rubbing his temple again. He knew, everyone knew, the whole case was built on shortcuts, on bias, on the same system that had steamrolled countless defendants before Jalen ever walked into that courtroom. But this time, the system had blinked first. Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses slowly. Does the prosecution have anything further? Carrington's face was flushed red, his hands clenched around the edges of his file. No, Your Honor. Grayson stared at him for a long moment, then turned to Jalen. Another beat of silence. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice heavy. Case dismissed. For a second, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, chaos. Half the room erupted. Voices rising, reporters scribbling, cameras flashing like gunfire. But Jalen didn't move. He just stood there, letting the moment settle. He wasn't surprised. He'd known exactly how this would play out from the moment he stood up to represent himself. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with shouting voices and flashing lights. Reporters swarmed him on the steps, microphones shoved in his face. Jalen, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? How does it feel to outmaneuver a veteran prosecutor? What are you going to do next? Jalen just pulled his hoodie over his head. He wasn't interested in the spectacle. This was never about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, his mother was waiting, arms crossed, face unreadable. For a long second, she just looked at him. Then she shook her head. Boy, you scared me half to death. Jalen chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She stared at him, eyes glassy, then pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. Across the street, Judge Grayson stood by his car watching quietly. The arrogance was gone. In its place, reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another black kid. Another conviction, another closed file. But now, he'd remember Jalen Dawson, because Jalen had done something most defendants never could. He'd made the system look at itself, and for once, it blinked first. The truth is, this story isn't just about Jalen. It's about every case that never made the news, every life that got swallowed by a broken system, every defendant who never had the knowledge or the voice to fight back. Jalen did, but what about the ones who didn't? He knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in, but next time, he wouldn't be the defendant, he'd be the attorney, and when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, even for a second, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people, and people can change, but only if we make them. The end. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more content like this.